All right, so in this next lecture, we're going to be talking about R-selected and K-selected species and what that means in terms of survivorship, what this means in terms of reproductive strategies. So remember, R is going to be the rate of population growth, and K is going to be the carrying capacity of a particular population. So R, remember, is births minus deaths, or how fast your population is growing or shrinking. K is sort of this theoretical maxima that your population can't really get very much higher than. So different species have different characteristics that affect the number of fertile offspring that they bear. So this should be fairly intuitive to you. Flies are not humans, humans are not fish, and just because of the sort of different lifestyles that these organisms have, it's going to affect the amount of kids they're having. So some species are K-selected or equilibrium species. These are physically large. Their environments are relatively stable, and they lavish a lot of attention on few offspring. So this would be like an example of this would be humans. We take care of our children for 9 months in the womb and then 18 to however long after they've been born. All right, this would be like elephants. You know, elephants have a huge gestational period. I think it's like 12 months. And then they care for their offspring for 10 or more years as they're growing up. Okay, these are K-selected species. They have a relatively stable environment. They're not like gaining and losing a lot of food. Environmental and temperature changes aren't really affecting them as much. So the pressures on K-selected species are density dependent, meaning that if you have too many elephants in a particular region, it's going to limit the amount of elephants that you can have. There's only so much food that can be eaten, okay? So as a population's density goes up, factors that limit the population's growth assert themselves ever more strongly. So kind of what I mean by this is that if you have an organism like elephants, and let's say the carrying capacity of a particular population of elephants is, we'll say 150, because that's just the area that they live in. If you were to suddenly, let's say you have a really very fruitful generation, and then you were to have 200 elephants, the factors that limit population growth are going to assert themselves more and more strongly the more elephants you have. There's going to be less food, there's going to be less water, there's going to be more and more problems with that number of elephants living in an area. And so these K-dependent species usually stay right around their carrying capacity. They don't really alter very much from it, because as you get more and more individuals, there are more and more pressures keeping those populations down. R-selected species, or opportunist species, are usually smaller. Their environments are usually somewhat unstable, and they don't really care about their offspring after they have created them. So an example of this would be, like a great example would be like flies. Flies don't have a stable environment, right? They're just sort of flying around wherever they can go. As soon as they're laying their eggs, that's kind of it for their parental. Their offspring are pretty much on their own after they're laid, okay? So K-dependent species, larger, more parental care, they tend to stay around carrying capacity. R-selected species, smaller, not very much parental care, and pressures that keep them in check aren't really related to the population's density. They're related to other things like what's eating them, or what's the environmental conditions like, what season is it, how much space is available, or actually probably a better example would be what season is the best example for that. So here are elephants. I was just talking about elephants. Their carrying capacity stays, or their numbers stay right around the carrying capacity. Okay, they are relatively stable in their population size. They are larger. They provide more parental care. Here you have flies, and you can see their population spike and then die off, and then spike and then die off. These are only really limited by their reproductive rate. Okay, they have unstable population size. Their population size is not density dependent. It doesn't really matter how many flies there are. That's not going to determine how many more flies can be born. Again, they are shorter lived, they produce fewer offspring, and they don't really care for their offspring. So over here you have the K equilibrium, um, K selected equilibrium species, and then you have the R selected opportunist species. So now we're going to talk about survivorship curves, and a survivorship curve is basically how soon species members tend to die within the species lifespan. So this is think about human beings. We usually die at the end of our expected lifespan. So we'll look at some of these curves here. So there is late loss type 1, constant loss type 2, early loss type 3. I'm not worried about type 1, type 2, or type 3, but I would like you to know late, constant, and early losses for these. So here is like where humans or elephants are up here. This is where we fit. And most of our individuals live until we are quite old, and then we die here. Okay, after we've gotten quite old. Obviously, some people some elephants are dying earlier for whatever reason, but usually we're dying fairly old. Here's a constant lot species like this little bird here, and these birds apparently are just kind of dying throughout their lifespan. They just kind of are constantly being lost throughout here. They die at all ages. It doesn't matter how old or young you are, you're just going to die kind of randomly throughout your lifespan. Then you have early lost species like these flies, and these flies are dying off usually quite young, so they're probably reproducing here somewhere and then dying off relatively quickly after. And you can see this is on a spectrum of R selected species to K selected species. So K selected species tend to be late loss. R selected species tend to be early loss species. So next we're going to talk about human populations.